Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Travel with an Engineer. Today we are going to visit the Sutter's Fort. Sutter's Fort is not only the first non-indigenous permanent settlement in Central Valley, California, which eventually became Sacramento, but also it is the first non-indigenous settlement that was established out of the Pacific coast in California. Before we start, please note that Sutter's Fort is a living museum. So the purpose of the fort is to show how people lived in this fort in the middle of the 19th century. So it is not necessarily an engineering or scientific museum. However, as you may expect, engineering and technological achievement were an integral part of the people's living. So we are going to see a lot of weapons, different industries such as blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, gunsmith shop, bakeries, distilleries, candle making shop, textile factories, etc. Now, as always, the objective here is not just to visit a place. We want to integrate history, engineering and science, and traveling into a single package. So I will be using this opportunity that visiting this fort is providing us to first discuss a little bit about John Sutter himself. And this is important because not only he founded Sutter's Fort as the first non-indigenous permanent settlement in Central Valley, California, and the seed for the establishment of the city of Sacramento, but also he was a major factor on many of the events and locations that we are going to visit later on. Some of which are the discovery of gold and the California gold rush, when I visit Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park in Coloma, California, among many other gold rush related sites. The formation of City of Sacramento and Sutter Creek, when we visit the Fort Ross and we discuss about the presence of Russians in California, and also when we discuss about the Donner Party. So because of all these reasons, before visiting the fort, let's briefly review John Sutter's biography. John Sutter was a pioneer and businessman with very colorful character. It is reported that at some point he falsely claimed that he was a captain in the French army and was a member of Swiss Guard. Perhaps you know that Swiss Guard is small elite military in Vatican who are in charge of the security of the Pope. As we noted, he was immensely influential during the early history of California, and his influence continues to our time. Reportedly, over 250 entities in California are named after him, which includes a county, Sutter County, two cities, Sutter Creek and Sutter, which formerly was known as Sutter City, a health care service provider, and a hospital, and many streets, schools, and businesses. To understand the importance of John Sutter, it might be helpful to know that a large version of this portrait of President Lincoln that you can see here currently hang in the California Assembly House overlooking the entire hall. But this portrait was installed in 1909. And before that, there was a similarly large portrait of John Sutter hung inside the California Assembly. And it was not just John Sutter that has huge impact in California's history. Even some of his employees later became major figures in their own right. One of those employees was Peter Lassen, who worked for Sutter as a blacksmith. Later in one of the episodes, we will visit the Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is named after Peter Lassen. John Sutter was a Swiss born in Germany, in a German city close to the border of the Switzerland, near the city of Basel in Switzerland. He was born in 1803
in this house.
and his birth name was Johann Augustus Sutter. As a young man, when he was in Switzerland and Germany, he got involved in several businesses and professions, and he failed them all. And this was not because he was not smart enough, as was evident by him being able to speak four languages: German, French, English, and Spanish. But primarily because he tended to spend more than he earned. While reading about him, I came to conclusion that he was a very generous person, at least toward Europeans, both in Europe and the new country, the United States, as it was reported that he was very generous toward new immigrants and he helped them as much as he could. Although, as we will see, this generosity may not be extended to non Europeans, particularly Native Americans. So he was not financially successful in Europe. So in 1834, he borrowed equivalent to $7,000 from his mother in law and took that money and ran away with the help of his wife toward the United States, leaving his wife and children behind. So when he landed in the United States, he had the arrest warrant for stealing that money. After landing, he changed his name to what we know him now, John Sutter. Now, during first 5 years of his stay in the United States, he again tried several different professions and he again failed them all. So all the time he lived on borrowed money. But while traveling and trying different businesses, he learned a couple of important lessons, including the importance of the fort in creating trade posts and how to use Native American as a labor in the businesses. To escape his debts again, in 1939 he fled to the west of the United States. And on his trip to the west, he visited Hawaii and Alaska. Now, to get a sense of the period and have a point of reference, note that 1939 was 9 years before the discovery of the gold in California, which started California Gold Rush. It was 11 years before California seceded from Mexico and joined the Union, and 22 years before the start of the Civil War. Now, at that time, he landed in California. And as I said, this was over a decade before California joined the United States. So at that time, California was governed by Mexican authority. So he approached the local Mexican government and he was granted Mexican citizenship. He convinced the Mexican local government to grant him nearly 50,000 acres of land in Central Valley. Initially, the Mexican local government was reluctant, but then they agreed with the proposal, and their hope was that they could establish a footprint inland in California, and so they can control Native American in the region. So the condition for this land grant was that he could develop the land in a year. Now, it is important to notice that by that time, European settlers were in California for over 7 decades. The first mission, the Spanish-style church, was established in San Diego in 1769. And last one was established in Sonoma in 1823. If we look at this map of mission that was established by Spanish, you can see that all of them were located along the Pacific coast. So by the time that Sutter got that land grant, the Spanish and later the Mexican government could not form a settlement in Central Valley, California, or generally anywhere out of the Pacific coast. Now you may ask, why is the case? Why they never tried to establish a footprint inland in California? And the record shows that actually there was several attempts to do exactly that, but all of them failed for one reason or another. So the next question could be, if the previous attempts were not successful, how and why Sutter was successful in establishing this settlement, as we will see later. I have seen several researchers has presented several different reasons. For example, one of them mentioned that, as we will see, when Sutter visited Hawaii, he hired 10 Hawaiians to work for him. And that researcher believed that because of the presence of those Hawaiians with him, the Native Americans trusted him to some degree. However, I don't think that is a very strong argument. Perhaps that has some impact, but the impact would have been very small. But the stronger reason might be the fact that just a few years earlier, nearly a three-quarter of the local native population was wiped out by the outbreak of malaria, which, by the way, was brought by European colonists. Because Native Americans were not exposed to European disease, so they didn't have any resistance in their body against those diseases. So as soon as they were exposed to those disease, they contracted the disease, and many of them died because of that. And this is not just for this region. This happened all over North America and South America. So because of this major loss of population, the Native American perhaps agreed to work for Sutter to gain access to more resources and protection so they can recover faster. Or even more likely, simply they didn't have enough strength to fight or resist this colonization. So in 1839, his party, which included himself, 3 Europeans, and 10 Hawaiians, as I mentioned, 8 male and 2 females, landed in the bank of American River. The place that he and his companion landed now is called Sutter's Landing Regional Park, as you can see here. After landing, the Hawaiians that were with Sutter built some Hawaiian-style base camps, and then the construction of the fort, which he called Fortress New Helvetia, the New Switzerland fort, began in 1941. The location of the fort was selected to meet several demands, including the closeness to the river, being at high ground so they can be protected against attack and flood, good soil for agriculture, and availability of water. And reportedly, the Native Americans in that region actually helped Sutter to find this location. And it turns out that the purpose of the fort was not really protection from attacks, because there was no attacks, there was no enemy. The Native Americans were so weak at the time that they couldn't impose any credible threat against the settlement. So the purpose really was to impress the locals and attract new immigrants so they can settle around the fort. He used Native American local tribes to make bricks and cut trees for the fort. The first structure, which was a 2-story adobe building, was completed in 1843. This building is currently the main structure that is located at the center of the fort and is the only original building in the complex. Or better to say, almost original, because it is reported that 70% of the bricks and 55% of the wood that was used in this building right now are original. And this building is significant in the history of the California Gold Rush because this is where Sutter and James Marshall met in 1948. We will extensively discuss in another episode about James Marshall. He was an employee of John Sutter, and he was sent to build the Sutter's Mill at where now is Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. And while building that mill, Marshall discovered the first gold in Central Valley. He actually traveled through what is called the Old Cloma Road that connected Cloma to the fort. This road opened in 1847, and its beginning is now marked by this plaque. And after the gold rush started, thousands and thousands of 49ers, as the prospector of the time were called, passed through this road to go to the gold county to look for the gold. So Marshall found the gold, and 4 days after the founding, he met John Sutter in this building to show the gold to him. And as the story goes, Sutter had a book that explained how you can identify if the gold is real or not. So he conducted a couple of very simple experiments, and he noticed that the gold is real, and that's how the gold rush started. Although Sutter and Marshall decided to keep this a secret, but as you may expect, the secret got out and the whole history of California was changed when people learned that there is a gold in California and the gold rush of California started. The Sutter office and sleeping quarter were in this building, as you can see here. When this building was completed, the wall and other structure were steadily added to the fort. The walls were and are 2.5 feet thick. This is like 3/4 of meter thick, and between 15 and 18 feet tall. This is between 4.5 and 5.5 meter tall. Now currently, the fort occupies an area of 312 by 156 feet, that is like 95 by 48 meter, which is somehow smaller than the original complex. Reportedly, this is due to a miscalculation during the early construction of the fort. Now, inside the wall, the fort includes many rooms for sleeping quarters and also different shops. Blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, gunsmith shops, bakery, distillery, grist mill, blanket factory and textile machine, candle making shop, etc. Outside the wall, there were also more houses for the settlers and corrals for the livestock. In the 50,000 acre land that he received from the Mexican authority, and in fact this later increased to nearly 200,000 acres, Sutter created an agricultural empire, which included planting agricultural products such as wheat, vegetables, and fruits, raising cattle for food, wool and leather goods, and fish processing. There were also fur processing, blanket making, and copperage, that is, barrel making facilities in and around the fort. And as I noted earlier, Sutter welcomed and encouraged settlers to settle around the fort for primarily two reasons: to have a labor force for the operation of this agricultural complex, and also he needed people to buy his products, so he needed consumer for the product that was produced in his empire. Later, in 1841, he also bought the Fort Ross, which we will discuss extensively later on in another episode. This was a fort in the Pacific coast, which is like 90 miles north of San Francisco. This fort was established by the Russians. Again, it's a long story, which is beyond the scope of our today discussion, but later we will have an extensive discussion about Fort Ross. But anyway, he bought this Fort Ross and moved everything possible, all the tools and equipment and weapons, cannons, from Fort Ross to Sutter's fort. And this purchase significantly helped the development of Sutter's fort. It is interesting to know that the cannons and other weapons in the fort were never fired to defend the fort, but they were fired to frighten and force the Native American to submission to work for him. It is even reported that original main door to the fort was moved from Fort Ross to this fort. Having said that, as usual, he overspent in buying Fort Ross, so he had a lot of struggle later to pay back for the credit he received to purchase Fort Ross. Now, as we discussed, John Sutter extensively used Native American as a labor to build the fort and also create and operate and maintain his agricultural empire. So naturally, the relationship between Sutter and the Native American has been scrutinized since then. And actually, it is a very controversial issue. It is the fact that Sutter did not massacre natives or militarily conquer them, at least not in a large scale, as happened by many other settlers and colonizers. And because of this, some experts believed that while he was not an angel, relative to many other encounters between Western colonists and natives, he treated the natives more humanely. which there might be some truth to that. However, it is also the fact that he could not create it and maintain his empire without the Native American labor. So the main question here is that were the natives voluntarily worked for him and whether he paid them for their service or not. And it turns out that while some of the natives volunteered and were paid for their service, many more were forced to work for him, practically as slaves, albeit on a temporary basis. While initially, after landing, he traded items for native labor, later he formed a militia group primarily composed of Native Americans that he hired. So now it is well established that after the fort was completed, whenever Sutter needed labor force from natives, he asked for people to work for him. So if they cooperated, he was fine. But if they refused to cooperate and work for him, he attacked them by his militia and forced them for submission and cooperation. And because of the overwhelming weapons that he had, he always was able to defeat the locals. So really the local had two options: either work for him voluntarily or to be forced to work for him. Even there are reports that whenever there was not enough laborers around the fort, he sent his militia to far distances to round people and bring them back to the fort at gunpoint and force them to work. And this happened even to very young children. Even he sometimes, quote unquote, gave these children to other plantations as a gift. So my conclusion was that while he was not as violent and brutal as some other colonists who wiped out the entire tribes, he was not and should not be considered and treated as a hero or a symbol. He committed many terrible atrocities against Native Americans. And for that reason, perhaps it was appropriate that his statue near the fort was removed in 2020, as you can see from this news from a local news agency. Now, if you want to learn more about this issue, I recommend you to watch the documentary that is on a TV at the beginning of the tour, where the opinions of contemporary Native Americans and experts on this issue are presented. Sutter proved to be very resilient in operating his businesses and his relationship with Mexican and later American authority. As you know, in 1946, there was the Bear Flag Revolt in California, which resulted in secession of California from Mexico and the formation of so-called the Republic of California for just a few weeks, which ended up in Mexican War and annexation of California to the United States. And during this entire turmoil, Sutter survived and maintained the control of his fort and his agricultural empire. Although, for a very short period, he was imprisoned by Americans for his association with the Mexican government, but right after the war, he was released and was given back his properties. So his empire was thriving until 1948. And ironically, what brought about his downfall was the discovery of gold in his property in Coloma, as we discussed. You may think, okay, he found gold in his property, and this is a good thing, and he will make tons of money out of this gold. But unfortunately for Sutter, this is not what happened. As we discussed, he and Marshall tried to keep the discovery of gold as a secret, but very soon the word got out and people in California and later on in the United States and later the entire world were aware of this major gold discovery. So many people wanted a piece of this cake, and that's how the gold rush started in 1849. And initially, Sutter actually benefited from these gold miners. Obviously, when people came to the area, he had more customer for his product, and he rented some of his properties to these miners. And later, he himself actually did some prospecting to find and extract gold. But eventually, he and his empire greatly suffered from the gold rush, primarily for two reasons. One was many of his own employees deserted him to look for gold, because after all, their income from finding the gold, especially in early days of gold rush, was way more than what Sutter was paying to his employee. Equally important, or perhaps even more important, was that many of the 49ers, those miners that came to California, even didn't recognize his claim to the ownership of his land. And their ground was that this land was given to him by the Mexican authority, not by the American. So he didn't have legitimate claim to this land, and he was not even a US citizen. So the miners just didn't honor his claim to the ownership, and they started to look for the gold in his land and claiming the land for themselves. So eventually Sutter had to sell the fort in 1849 for about $7,000. Now later, when we are visiting Old Sacramento, we will discuss a little bit more about this period, because at this time his oldest son, John Sutter Jr., also came to California, and John Sutter transferred the ownership of some of his property to his son, and his son divided some of those lands and sold it to different people and hired someone to design the initial layout of the city that very soon became Sacramento. But that's a different story for a different day. Now back to our own story. When Sutter sold the fort, it was used for several purposes, like as a hotel, as a storage facility, etc. But very soon, the fort was abandoned and fell into disrepair, to the degree that only the ruins of the central building remained. And actually, even at that time, this ruin was a kind of a tourist attraction. But all the walls and surrounding buildings were gone, particularly in the Great Flood in the area in 1862, which again we will discuss later when we are visiting Old Sacramento. In late 19th century, the city of Sacramento decided to demolish the site, but the local people and a local organization bought the fort and repaired it and reconstructed it to its former glory between 1891 and 1893, which was California's first preservation project for a historic site. And since then, Sutter's Fort, which for a while was called Fort Sacramento, has been a major historic site and a living museum. And since 1947, the fort has been operated as California State Park, and more accurately as Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. Now, considering the fact that the reconstruction itself took place over 130 years ago, even the reconstructed portion of the fort is historically significant, let alone the main building that is mostly original. Now, as for Sutter himself, for the rest of his life, he tried to get some compensation from the federal government for his losses during the gold rush, without any success. And he died in 1880 in Washington, D.C., while trying to petition the lawmakers to pay him something like $1.3 million for today's money for his losses. But he never succeeded, and after he died in DC, he was moved to Pennsylvania and he was buried there. One of the major events in mid-19th century was what is called the Donner Party. We will have a different episode on that, but just briefly, this was a couple of families that they wanted to come to California. And while they were traveling toward California, almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. And this combined with the worst winter in the recorded history. So they got stuck in the snow when they were trying to pass Sierra Nevada mountains. And when they were rescued, people found out they had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. And Sutter helped to rescue the Donner Party by sending a group to search for them and then bring them back and give them food and accommodation, etc. And one of the major items on display in the fort is what is called the Paddy Reed's doll, which is an actual doll that one of the little girls in the Donner Party carried with herself during this trip. And this usually is on display at Sutter's Fort. Although when I visited the fort, the doll was not on display and the sign said that it is being restored right now. You see, this is an old drawing from Joseph Warren Revere, which visited the fort in 1846-47. He worked for the US Army. He drew this during the occupation of the fort by American forces. So you can see here on the main building there is an American flag. And by the way, I heard that this oak tree that you can see here still exists. I tried to find it, but I'm not sure if I did. It is one of these trees that you can see here. In conclusion, Sutter's Fort is an amazing living museum that's certainly worth the time you spend in it. And it can help you to get familiar with how people lived in mid-19th century right before California's gold rush. And beside being a great living museum on its own right, since the fort and John Sutter himself are related and intertwined with many other events of the time, visiting the museum can give you some context and some background to understand other events and other locations that you might want to visit. The only criticism that I can have about the museum is that while you are visiting the exhibitions and different rooms, there is really no context explaining the background of each. Although there is relatively big room where there are posters explaining different aspects of the fort. Having said that, one might argue that that is the whole idea of living museum. That's why they are called living museum, because you emerge on how people lived at the time. And you cannot do that if there is a poster and explanation on every exhibition. So there is pros and cons, and this perhaps goes deep into the philosophy of different types of museum, which this is certainly not the right place to discuss about. Finally, if you have time, it is a very good idea to also visit State Indian Museum, which is just a few steps away from the fort. This museum was established in 1940, and as the name implies, it displays everything about the Native Americans of the region and the California in general. The items on display in this museum are from 60 different Native American tribes. And it is interesting to know that these Native American tribes spoke over 40 different languages with over 300 dialects. And you can see from a canoe to basketry at every shape and size. It is a fascinating museum. I highly recommend you to visit the museum if you can, because archaeological evidence shows that the Native Americans might have lived in California in one form or another for thousands of years, if not millions. What I really love about this museum and Native American culture in general is their belief that everything and everyone in the nature is interconnected. So they were the manifestation of sustainability. You can learn in this museum that up to 80% of their diet could come from acorn.
that they collected from the forest. What this means is that they had to collect nearly 1 ton of acorn per adult per year. So it is fascinating to see that considering their population, they collected this much acorn from the nature for tens of thousands of years, and still they could go on if their life was not interrupted by European colonizers. It is estimated that over 1 million Native American was living in California before arrival of Europeans. And in the span of 50 years, nearly 900,000 of them died or killed from violence, wars, hungers, and displacements that imposed on them by the colonists. Or, as we discussed, by the contagious disease such as smallpox and malaria that brought by the settlers. Unlike many other Native Americans that lived in the interior of the United States, buffaloes or bisons never lived in California. So they never were part of California's Native American diet or culture.